Hello, and welcome to today's Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Jason Anderson, and I will be introducing and moderating today's seminar. Our Friday Transportation Seminars have been a tradition since the year 2000. These seminars are once again being held live on Portland State University's urban campus located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place. Remember these communities and honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Today, we are pleased to have Catie Gould and Jeannette Lee presenting on the next wave of abolishing parking mandates. Catie Gould, Sightline, is a Sightline Institute researcher, focuses on climate and transportation policy. She brings a decade of experience in engineering and data analysis into Sightline's efforts to decarbonize our transportation system. Prior to coming to Sightline, she led advocacy work for better bike and bus infrastructure in Portland and wrote about local transportation issues. Jeannette Lee, Sightline Institute's senior researcher and Alaska lead, focuses on democracy and housing issues from Sightline's office in Anchorage, Alaska. Prior to Sightline, she served as a consultant at the Adaptation Fund and United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a federal natural gas researcher, and a journalist for the Associated Press in Alaska and Hawaii, and Atlantic Media Company in Washington, D.C. This is the last seminar in the Fall 2022 series. Details for winter 2023 will be coming soon. As an overview of today's seminar, you can expect our speaker to present for about 40 minutes, or our speakers, followed by a Q&A session. We will be receiving questions through the Q&A feature on your control panel, and we'll ask them at the end of the presentation. If we run out of time for all your questions, we will give our speaker the opportunity to email written responses for any questions left unanswered. We have enabled closed captioning, but you must click on the CC feature on your control panel to view them. We will be recording today's webinar. It will be available on our website later today, along with the presentation slides. If you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. With that, I will hand it over to Catie and Jeannette. Catie and Jeannette.
Hello. Let me share my screen. Happy Friday, everyone. I know there's a little bit of a last minute change of plans for all you people who attended in person. I got COVID this morning, so we really appreciate you being flexible. But we're really excited to be here because we really love talking about parking reform, and lately there has been a lot to talk about. So first, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Catie Gould. I live here in Portland, and I'm a transportation researcher for Sightline. For about the last year, I've been writing almost exclusively about parking mandates, also commonly known as minimum parking requirements, and the impact that they have on our cities. And joining me today is my colleague Jeannette, joining from Anchorage.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeannette Lee, and I'm a senior researcher and Alaska lead for Sightline based in Anchorage, where I work on housing and democracy issues and parking.
And if you haven't heard of us, Sightline is a sustainability think tank. We're focused on the Pacific Northwest, and our mission is to make Cascadia a global model of sustainability. We work in all sorts of different areas, from democracy reform to transitioning fossil fuel infrastructure and abundant housing. And parking policy is a really critical part of our work because it has such a huge impact on how our communities are built and how we get around them.
So we're going to start off with the basics. What is a parking mandate? Well, nearly every building in the US, whether it's brand new or remodeled, is required to have a certain number of parking spaces. And that's based on the idea that if there's a parking space for every car, there'd be no parking problems. In reality, what these rules actually do is make new homes and businesses harder to build, and they also make it really hard to give old buildings new life, among other downsides, which we'll get into later.
In cities with parking mandates, building housing for people is dependent on having housing for cars. And that's a really big problem, solely for the fact that cars are really big. Between driveways and space to back up and navigate the aisles to parking lots, 2 parking spots can take up the same amount of space as a 2-bedroom apartment. So when cities require excessive amounts of parking, housing for people is often what loses out. So let's jump right into a case study. This is an affordable housing complex proposed by Home Forward, this affordable housing developer in Oregon. And this is in Troutdale, Oregon. So they want to build 94 homes and 119 parking spaces. If you do the math, it comes out to a ratio of 1.3 parking spaces per unit. In their application, Home Forward included actual parking demand for 5 other affordable housing developments in the region. And at the busiest time of day, those other developments only used an average of 1.1 parking spaces per unit. So it sounds pretty good, right? They're planning for more parking than what is average. But wrong. Troutdale actually requires 2 spaces per home, way more than Home Forward thinks that their residents need. So they requested a variance. But despite all the studies they submitted, the city denied it anyways. So here are some of the options that they're considering. Option 1, we delete most of this building down here in the bottom. That would cut 24 homes from the project, almost a quarter of what they planned on building, so they can turn this area into a parking lot. This change is estimated to cost $7,000 per unit in extra expenses and delay the project 3 to 4 months. Option 2, they can keep the same number of homes, but in order to make more parking here at the top of the screen, they have to condense all of the housing into one really big building. It's going to be 5 stories tall and now require an elevator. This is a really big architectural change. Obviously, this redesign is estimated to add $13,000 per unit and delay the project at least 6 months. All right, this third option is kind of the weirdest one. They can convert 500 square feet of one of these buildings into a commercial space, maybe like a coffee shop. How would that help? Now, this is a mixed-use development, right? Combining homes and business. And in Troutdale, mixed-use developments only have a minimum parking requirement of 1 space per unit instead of 2. So that's much closer than what they had originally asked for, but not so fast. Now that this project is in a different category, it actually requires a different variance because it goes over the allowed parking maximums for this type of project. So they have to get that variance now for the same number of homes and the same number of parking spaces that they originally asked for because of the inclusion of this coffee shop. That's not really a great option that they want to pursue anyways, because now this designation triggers new requirements from the state for prevailing wage standards. And the developer estimated that the increased labor expenses would add $16,000 to the cost of each unit, in addition to the $2,600 just for the architectural changes. This would all delay the project another 3 to 4 months. So Home Forward is really committed to building this project, but all of these options really stink. And this is a real waste in both time and money for them that they could be spending building more affordable housing elsewhere.
So here's an example from Anchorage where a housing project was shelved far earlier in the process, and it was all over parking. This picture is of Kerry Shifley. He has an e-bike store, which is pictured behind him here in Anchorage in the Spenard neighborhood. And several years ago, Kerry looked into purchasing the building he operates out of. And he wanted to expand the shop space and add a second story with 3 apartments. He had the architectural drawings and the financing in place, but he didn't have enough parking according to city code. He thought about, he couldn't expand outward, like he couldn't build more surface parking. So he actually thought about digging underneath the building to provide underground parking, but that is far too expensive, as we'll see in a later slide. So he ended up dropping the project before even applying for the variance. You might be wondering why he didn't fight harder to get that variance. Well, he had at the front of his mind this super popular restaurant called the Rustic Goat, which had caused a neighborhood uproar over parking. And because of the Rustic Goat, he didn't think there was any chance the Planning Commission would grant a variance. And he didn't want to spend the money to navigate what would certainly be an uncertain process.
It's not really a surprise that every option that Home Forward presented included surface parking lots. It's not a surprise that Shifley saw the estimate of how much it cost to build underground parking and walked away from the project. This chart is a recent estimate from Fixer. They're a company that specializes in estimating construction costs. And this shows kind of a price range of how much different types of parking lots cost to build. So surface parking lots are the cheapest, maybe coming in around $3,000 to $5,000 per parking space. Underground parking is by far the most expensive, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 per space. So these costs have a really big impact on development. If the zoning code requires that your business needs 30 parking spaces, but the property can only accommodate 25, you're really in a lot of trouble, because moving from building a surface parking lot to even just having the parking underneath the building and raising the building up can multiply your cost per space tenfold, right? It can easily make projects no longer financially feasible. And we pay for these costs all the time, even if parking is free to use for you. It gets rolled into the price of everything that we buy, from the price of coffee to your rent. The Victoria Transport Policy Institute estimated that one parking space required for every housing unit increases rent by 12%, and 2 parking spaces can increase housing costs by 25%.
So parking requirements typically show up in a city's zoning code under land use, and they specify a certain number of parking spots based on the size and use of a building. And why? Why do we have these here? Because they're easy numbers to find in a permit application. So here's, you can see a restaurant requires 1 parking spot for every 250 square feet. And parking spots are actually 350 square feet in terms of size on average, meaning the land area dedicated to parking is going to be larger than the restaurant. So we have a quick question for the audience. Does anyone recognize what zoning code this is from? I can't actually see if there are any hands.
No, we
up,
can't see it. We can't see any of you.
You can hear me now though, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So educated guess, anybody?
Just go with your
Cameron.
gut if you don't know.
I'm seeing a lot of head shaking back and forth as no,
Okay.
and no educated guesses.
Well, if you're all ready, then Katie's ready to reveal the answer.
Go
Yeah.
for it.
Oh, this should have been easy. This is actually Portland. A lot of people think that Portland has eliminated parking requirements, but that's not actually true. We like to say we've effectively eliminated them because we have so many exemptions in place across the city. But I pulled this out of the zoning code last week. Table's still there.
And this is Anchorage's zoning code. And you can see these requirements are extremely specific, and they often assume maximum use scenarios. So here you see that Anchorage requires bowling alleys to have 4 parking spots for each lane, assuming, and that basically assumes that league night is 24 hours a day and everyone on the team drives separately. Well, I can tell you, I recently took the family to a bowling alley in Anchorage. We all drove in one car because my kids can't drive. And there were 4 of us. We used a lane. So we definitely did not use all 4 spots. And I think that's pretty common for a lot of people who go bowling here. Because, you know, most of the time that bowling alley parking lot is going to look like this. So this is Center Bowl in Anchorage, where I took my family. This is from a Sunday afternoon in August. And as you can see, this is a huge waste of space that could be lots of other things instead. So it wasn't always this way, our approach to parking in this country. Parking requirements are a product of the 20th century. They're a policy put in place by cities to accommodate the rise of car culture. And by the 50s, these rules were in place across the US, and they've been with us ever since. I like to describe these mandates as highly specific, but not scientific. And that's because based on very little data, planning departments essentially copied each other's parking requirements with, just because, it was easy. We could take one city's parking requirements and apply it to ours. We don't have to do anything else. And as you've seen, they're extremely detailed and prescriptive. So we've had to live with the problems caused by these rules ever since. And as we've shown, parking makes housing more expensive, makes it harder to build even enough to meet demand. Historic buildings are essentially blocked from being rehabilitated and instead fall into disrepair in many, many cases. And excess parking causes sprawl, making communities even more dependent on cars to get around.
All right, before we go for the whole rest of the presentation, I just wanted us all to take like a deep breath together. I know talking about parking, it can like spin up a lot of feelings in people. And I kind of wanted to review 3 reasons why eliminating parking requirements is not really a radical idea. The first thing I like to remind people in conversations when we're talking about this is that there are already buildings in your community that do not meet the current code, right? These buildings are not ruining your neighborhood, they are your neighborhood. Earlier this year, I had a conversation with California Assembly member Laura Friedman, and she told me a story about when she was serving on her city council in Glendale, California. And there was a specific case that really stuck with her about this family that wanted to remodel their house. They wanted to add on a bathroom, but in order to get the permits, they would also need to add a 3-car garage, which is, prohibitively expensive and really ridiculous. You see, in Glendale, like a lot of other cities, particularly in California, not only did the zoning code require off-street parking, but they required that parking to be enclosed, right? Essentially in a garage. A lot of older houses don't have garages because they predate when that zoning code was adopted. And property owners might not even realize that this is an issue until they try to build an addition or something else that requires a permit from the city, which is when they find out that their building is non-conforming and they have to make a lot of changes to get it up to code in order to make future changes.
Okay, here's another example of a building without enough parking, under code anyway, that doesn't actually need any more. For 2 years, Turnagain Brewing in Anchorage operated with no issues, and it wasn't until the brewery applied to participate in the city's COVID-19 relief program that the planning department noticed a discrepancy in the building permit. The primary issue was parking, of course. The previous owners had done a renovation that added more interior space, and because of that expansion, the city code required the building to have 23 parking spaces, but the brewery only had 17. It's operating under the old square footage requirements. So threatened with a loss of a critical part of their business, Turnagain Brewing's best option was to conduct a parking study and hope the city would approve it. So for 2 weeks, the owner surveyed the parking lot personally. And during that time, there was only one occasion where the lot was full. That was 7 p.m. on a single Friday night. Lots of patrons bike to Turnagain Brewing since it's near one of the entrances to Anchorage's trail system. And so often the lot is nearly empty of cars, but the brewery is hopping since so many people bike there. And anyway, the end result was that the brewery eventually entered into a parking agreement with the city. Because of the takeout sales, this arrangement recategorized a third of the brewery's space from bar to retail, which then lowered the parking requirement. It was kind of complicated. It was a big headache. It was very stressful for the owner during this pandemic year to have to be thinking about this. And then, it also kind of leads to this question of whether cities should be encouraging people to drive to drinking establishments by forcing those establishments to provide excessive amounts of parking. Just food for thought.
So even when you build off-street parking spots, there's no guarantee that drivers are actually going to use them. There was a recent study out of Sacramento, California that found 1 in 3 single-family homes with a garage never had a car parked inside, right? Instead, they used that space for extra storage like this or an extra living space. And other studies have found that this occurs at even higher rates. One study in the Mission District of San Francisco found that 47% of garages there never stored a car. And then another is actually a 9-year study, found that 3 out of 4 garages in middle-class homes in Los Angeles had too much stuff stored in there to park a car. So this kind of gets to the folly of when cities like Glendale are requiring garages, imagining that that's where every car is going to park. It's just not realistic. That's not how people use them. And they might as well be requiring every house to have a really enormous walk-in closet, whether you want one or not. Even in the dense west end of Vancouver, British Columbia, an abundance of off-street parking spaces didn't prevent them from having on-street parking problems. So a few years ago, this kind of came to a head, and they did a bunch of studies. And during the busiest time of day, the on-street parking was 88% full, right? So pretty nearly full all the time. But at the same time, off-street parking garages were still half empty. And this area had had parking requirements for decades. And for every 2 residents that owned a car in this neighborhood, there were 3 off-street parking spaces. So why weren't they getting used? Right? One, people like parking on the street. It's pretty convenient. You can't stop them from doing it. It's also parking on the street was a lot cheaper than paying rent for one of those off-street parking garage spaces. So we wanted to ask another question to everyone in the room. What is left for the city to do at this point, right? How do you solve this problem?
Anybody? More transit.
I love that answer.
Active transportation.
What they actually did is the city installed parking meters. So they added meters to 22 blocks that were currently free to park, and they also raised the price of parking permits, right, that residents could buy for on-street parking. And that was how the streets cleared up. So to give you an impact kind of the change, I think us in the US and sometimes in Portland feel like, how does on-street parking management work? Can it work? Before the change, right, they had this occupancy rate of 85%. They want it to be less than 85% full, and 4 out of every 5 blocks were more full than that, right? So very congested area. And afterwards, right, 2 years later, after all these changes, now 0 blocks were over that threshold. So very successful change.
So it's easy to assume that if any less parking gets built, there will suddenly be a shortage of spaces and people will have to stop driving. We had this come up in Anchorage when we were doing our own parking reform. But there are a lot of unused parking spots in America. In fact, researchers estimate there are likely 3 to 4 spaces for every car in this country. And study after study shows that off-street parking lots rarely get full. For example, in Anchorage, the city did a survey in the late 2000s. They looked at 35 sites and found that 1 of every 4 required parking spots were never used. Huge waste. When Edmonton, Alberta, in Canada recently surveyed parking demand over 300 sites, they found that only 7% of those lots ever got close to full, even at the busiest times of day. It was far more common for those sites to be less than half full. Edmonton also found that those underused parking spots were all across the city. They were not able to find any clear geographic trends when it came to unused parking. It's all over our cities. But there is some good news. Cities are increasingly choosing to get out of the business of regulating off-street parking altogether. And they're going further than just exempting downtown areas where, it's very dense. More cities each year are choosing to just repeal these regulations citywide. Anchorage, I'm very proud to say, is the most recent city we were able to add to this list. Just last week, with hardly any opposition, the Assembly, which is our city council, voted 12-0 unanimously to eliminate parking mandates for the whole city. And this decision has an outsized impact for the state of Alaska, since about 40% of Alaska's population lives in Anchorage. And the city actually covers an area larger than Rhode Island. Fun fact. So I want to give a little political background on this. Anchorage Assembly is nonpartisan, but everyone knows where the members stand politically. The Assembly is majority progressive, I can safely say, and the reform sponsors were both progressive and conservative. And so that was really pretty amazing because the mayor is quite conservative. And so he and the Assembly tend to clash on lots of things: the budget, the director of the library, COVID restrictions, like they get in fights all the time about stuff. But on parking reform, the mayor actually sent out this congratulatory tweet. And it was really a breath of fresh air. It was a rare and very welcome instance of total agreement between the Assembly and the mayor. It was pretty amazing. We did see some concern from residents. There was a recent op-ed in the Anchorage Daily News from somebody, I think he was like an engineer, a transportation engineer, who's concerned about these changes in terms of like impacting drivers. And, you know, I guess he's afraid that he's gonna have to give up his car maybe. But as we'll show later, getting rid of parking mandates does not equal getting rid of cars or parking or driving. You know, we are pragmatists here at Sightline, and we recognize that cars will always be part of the transportation mix.
And if you haven't been to Anchorage before, this is a lovely picture of just a downtown parking lot, which there are many, many of. So that brings us to our next point. Parking reform is getting really big, and states are also starting to get into the game. This summer, Oregon and California took statewide action to block local governments from imposing parking mandates in some situations. I'm happy to say that Oregon was first on this. In July, the Oregon Land Conservation and Development Commission adopted a broad rulemaking package called Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities. This rulemaking package included a lot of different things, from transportation planning to building heights and zoning, but also lifts parking requirements in many instances. And those rules apply to all jurisdictions within Oregon's 8 metro areas, which is home to 60% of the state's population. So pretty big reform. And a few months later, in September, the California legislature adopted AB 2097. That's their bill that prohibits cities from requiring off-street parking within a half a mile of frequent transit stops statewide. This was a really huge success for them. It was the 3rd attempt to pass a bill like this in a decade, and we expect that more states are going to follow. All right, so in Oregon on January 1st, right, so that's less than 1 month away now, for a lot of situations, off-street parking is going to become fully optional for a whole host of uses. There's a really long list of equity-related uses like homeless shelters or childcare facilities, but some of these other ones we think are going to be really impactful. And that includes small housing, so single room occupancy housing, and also all residential units smaller than 750 square feet. All regulated affordable housing, like that Troutdale example that we went through earlier. The rules also place an upper limit on how much parking cities can require for all multifamily housing. It caps it at one parking space per unit. So you can't require any more than that for those jurisdictions. And the other big category is all properties that are within a half a mile of frequent transit. So for most places, that means places that have a bus coming every 15 minutes during the peak hour service, but even smaller communities that don't have as good transit, the peak hour is defined, right, like just once per hour. So those properties will still get relief from parking requirements. And then near rail stops like the MAX or the West Lines, that distance increases to 3/4 of a mile. So I wanted to include this picture here on the right. This is kind of one of the examples of the buildings that are going to be re-legalized through this reform. This building has 16 studio apartments. They're all about 500 square feet and is close to a MAX line here in Portland. This building doesn't have any off-street parking at all because it was built in the 1920s, right? This is not a brand new thing that we're doing. We are allowing cities to develop in the way that they used to before all these rules came into place. All right, but let's take a look at what this transit coverage looks like. So this is a map of Eugene, Oregon. You can see in the teal here, that's their half-mile buffer from transit, so it covers a big portion of the city. This is Tigard, Oregon. Here in the red is covered. And then over here on the right, you can kind of see this little triangle bounded by highways. They've already gotten rid of their parking requirements years ago and have invited some new developments into that area. And then this one's a little bit hard to read. This is Milwaukee, Oregon, just south of Portland. They have MAX stations in addition to frequent bus lines. So there's a couple different colors going on here. But the only part of the city that they can have any parking requirements at all still in January is this kind of little section down here on the lower right that's not covered. And if you're, a city planner in Milwaukee, you might think, gosh, only like a quarter of our city can have parking requirements at all. Maybe it'd just be easier to get rid of all of them. Great, and yes, it will be easier to just get rid of all of them. There's another big deadline coming up for cities this summer. They'll have to pick one of 3 regulatory options to comply with the parking rules. And by far the simplest option is to just repeal parking requirements citywide. That's it, and you're done. If you do not want to do that, if you feel like the political support is not there or you don't like it, that's fine. But there's 2 other routes here of how you can comply with the rules. One focuses on fair pricing policies, right? So more price parking, unbundling parking from rents, things like that. And then another one has more exemptions from parking mandates. So there's less things that you can require parking for. So just to give you an idea of how important this kind of pathway is, if every city decided to go with option 1 here, we would be adding 48 more cities and a couple more counties to that chart we showed earlier. That would more than double the number of places in the United States that we know of that have fully repealed parking requirements citywide. So pretty exciting. And we think a lot of cities are going to choose that option just because it's simplest and they have a lot of other stuff to do. But not everybody agrees that this is a good idea yet. You might have heard in the news last month, there are 14 jurisdictions in Oregon that filed a lawsuit against the state to block these new rules. They requested a stay to prevent them from being enforced while the case awaits a judicial review. And if you remember that Troutdale example we gave earlier, that was one of 4 specific examples that were listed in the motion about how these rules will cause irreparable harm to Oregon cities. So Troutdale is claiming that if they no longer have the authority to require 2 parking spaces per unit, right? Even though they don't have any studies saying that they need 2 parking spaces per unit, that a lot of scary things are about to happen in their city, right? If they don't have sufficient parking, it will immediately worsen a parking problem in their city. It will have a bad effect on businesses. And they are claiming that even police response times are going to be slowed down because the streets are going to be congested, I guess, with people who are circling the block looking for parking.
Oh, that sounds really scary, right? And we want to respect people's fears, of course, but Troutdale's concerns don't actually match the research. So we want to talk about what really does happen when cities lift their parking requirements and let the private market decide how much to build.
One of the best examples that we have comes out of Buffalo, New York. They were one of the first cities to eliminate parking requirements citywide in 2017. And last year, there was a study published that covered 36 new major developments that were permitted in the 2 years afterwards. And the study found that 86% of the new buildings still provided off-street parking. And over half of them provided the same or more parking than they would have been required to before, right? So for most projects, nothing changed. And I like to say, lifting parking requirements, it doesn't have a huge impact overall, but it makes a huge impact for some specific projects. In Buffalo, those were clearly the mixed-use developments that combine housing and businesses together. And on average, those projects provided about half as much parking as would have been required to before. I know that sounds like a lot, a really big change. But for mixed-use developments, typically, when you have more than one use, those requirements are additive, right? So you have to meet the parking requirement for all the housing you have. You also have to meet the parking requirement for the restaurant or the office or whatever you're combining in the same building, even though all those uses see peak demand at different times, right? An office will be most full during the day. Residences will be most full overnight while people are sleeping. So it's much easier to share the parking lot. So this was a really big benefit for those type of projects to be able to decide how much parking they needed for themselves. But overall, across all 36 projects, the market built about 20% less parking than what was previously required. And if you look really deep into the details of this study, there was another really interesting find. The newly legalized building projects who opted to build less parking than they would have been required to before, they were much more economically productive for the city. Those developments constructed twice as many new homes and 2.2 times as much new business space as the projects that built more parking that would have complied with old requirements, even though they only built a few less parking spaces.
One of the most common concerns is that parking will disappear without requirements, right? Talked about this a little bit. So some parking lots do get redeveloped, but as long as there's a market for parking, people want it, there won't suddenly be a shortage overnight or even over many years. So downtown Buffalo exited the decade with even more parking spots than when it started. From 2010 to 2020, while its population grew by 7%, the number of parking spaces downtown increased at an even higher rate. And that translated to about 4,000 new parking spaces being added to supply during that time. We've talked a lot about how parking requirements hurt housing development, but on the flip side, what happens to home building once cities do away with parking requirements? Well, Seattle lifted parking mandates near transit, and in doing so, the study showed it actually boosted its housing supply. So from 2012 to 2017, more than half of new apartments were in buildings that would have been illegal under the old parking rules. And that comes out to about 35,000 homes, or almost 10% of Seattle's entire housing stock. That new flexibility allowed builders to avoid paving over 18,000 superfluous parking spaces.
Trying to assist perpetually vacant properties come back into use was the primary reason that planners in Fayetteville, Arkansas proposed eliminating commercial parking requirements in 2015, which they did. At the city planning office, they would get repeated phone calls about the same properties year after year. People would be kind of interested in them, but never really bought them or fixed them up. So the city thought, this is one thing that we can do to remove a barrier to these properties redeveloping. So this building here is right on the edge of downtown. It had been vacant for 40 years. So it was an older building. And 4 years after the zoning change, it finally reopened its doors as a restaurant. This building only has 5 off-street parking spaces, which is pretty much just used for employee parking. If you talk to the owners, parking can be a headache here. Since this place originally opened, the 2 nearby parking lots have been redeveloped into housing. This region is going through a bit of a building boom, Northwest Arkansas. But the view was the main draw that attracted the owners to this property in the first place. They really wanted a place that was near downtown. And it's great that they were able to make that trade-off. And lots of cities are asking today, how do you turn unused office space back into housing, right, to make downtown vibrant again after COVID? Well, Hartford, Connecticut has been making that happen since 2012, when they formed a new development agency to help provide gap funding to do exactly that and build up a population downtown. And they have a lot of formerly vacant buildings. And their work got a lot easier when the city adopted new form-based zoning code, which eliminated parking requirements citywide. So this is one of these projects called Teachers Village. It had been abandoned office building for 20 years, and now it is 60 homes aimed towards area educators. And for those 60 new homes, there's only 18 parking spots in an underground facility under the building. So all these residents have the option to lease a parking spot separately. And if you don't want one of those spots, then you get to save money on your rent. Other building conversions might not have parking at all. This building here was referred to As the largest pigeon coop in the state, it was in really, really bad shape, this former office building. And the one next door, they were combined into one project. So now there's 258 new homes here, these vacant buildings, and there's no parking on site for them. But down the street, you can see over here is a parking garage. So now there's an option for tenants with cars if they want an off-street parking space. There's a deal where they can rent one from this parking garage here. And this is a really win-win situation, right? Not only is it legal and cheaper to remodel these buildings, but it's also really good for the parking garages. As you can imagine, there's not as many people coming downtown to work as there were a few years ago. So these are just a few examples of what cities are experiencing after they lift parking requirements, but there's a lot more case studies coming. Just 2 weeks ago, the assembly members in Anchorage presented this map, which is online with the Parking Reform Network led by Portland's own Tony Jordan. They presented it along with their case of why their city should get rid of parking requirements. And that's pretty common. I've watched a lot of these council hearings in different cities, and this map comes up all the time because every year there's more and more cities that are getting added to it. Right? Eliminating parking requirements is not just a really progressive policy for big blue cities like San Francisco. It's also for small towns. It's for places without transit service. It's places that don't even have a parking meter yet. And it's getting increasingly easier for cities to see someone who's their peer on this map. And as we're getting more cities that are eliminating their parking requirements, and now even states, we're going to get an even larger trove of data in the future about how the market responds to this new flexibility and what outcomes we can actually achieve when this reform is done at scale. So this is a really exciting time for parking reform, and stay tuned. It's going to continue to be exciting. We put our slides online here, so you can go to this link and all of our slides will be there. We have some of the links in the speaker notes along with all of Jeanette's notes for each other as we're talking through this stuff. And also, if you want to get in touch with us, you can contact us by email or on Twitter for as long as it remains online. So anyways, I think we have quite a bit of time for questions, so we'd love to hear them.
Awesome. Thank you, Catie and Jeannette. Round of applause. So for those viewing the webinar, please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A feature in the control panel on the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll go ahead and start with a question or two from in the room. Anybody?
Hello, can you hear me?
It's not going to project. It's just for the people online.
Oh, okay. Okay, so hello, hi, thank you for the presentation. I just had a question, wondering the places where there is no transit, where I know you mentioned a little bit about it, but I'm wondering what was the impact in places that had no transit and when they apply these policies, because I used to work in a city that has very bad transit. People were against doing policies like this because they were, worried that how are my customers, the commerce were worried, how are my customers gonna get here? And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little about places where there is no transit, has been the feedback or the information you might have? And thank you.
Sure. Fayetteville has very little transit. Nobody thinks they have a viable transit service. They mostly have paratransit options, right? It's a small city. And when they were talking about it on their city council, right, there's this idea that if you get rid of parking requirements, it means that people won't be able to drive as much, right? Or that like it's a one-to-one, you're going to have to get people out of cars to do this type of reform. But in reality, it just provides more flexibility for people to provide as much parking as they think is needed, right? There's still a lot of parking. What also helped them out a little bit politically when they did this reform is that the city had just built a new public parking garage downtown. So that kind of alleviated some of people's worries about there maybe not being enough parking, and that the city would ensure that people could get around.
Yeah, and just adding some perspective from Anchorage. Anchorage does not have a very extensive transit system. The buses stop maybe every half hour. And the goal up here with parking reform was to get rid of excess parking. We have a lot of excess parking. And so it's not going to affect people's ability to find parking. There's more than enough. What it's going to allow people to do is build more housing more office space, rehabilitate old buildings, open new businesses, and things like that.
Yeah, and certainly parking requirements in
cutting the
general,
fat. Yeah.
they really hurt transit service, right? It's really hard to have a really good, viable population like transit service if everything is spread out by really huge parking lots. If you think about like transit service in the suburbs, who's taking transit there, right? There's not that many destinations. It's not very walkable once you get there. Sometimes like, you know, the Clackamas Center Mall that we have in our region during Christmas, right? The bus like normally goes into the parking lot of the mall, but it gets like so crazy during the holidays that they like stop servicing that bus stop, right? So this kind of parking lots and transit service don't go very well together already. So just being able to legalize future infill that's going to happen over decades, frankly, will set us up for better transit service in the future.
Okay, I have a quick question. So you showed a picture about a bowling alley not having it was empty and it was in August. Do you consider like the seasonal effects for places like bowling alleys or other indoor activities where those parking lots may be full in the winter months when it's cold or rainy? How would you consider that trade-off?
Yeah. So you're saying that, you know, there's usage is obviously going to peak. Like people aren't bowling in August in the summer in Alaska, although it was rainy that day. Actually, it was very rainy. So
It was
bowling
raining all August.
it would have been a very good activity actually for that day. But yeah, when you take away parking mandates, you let the business owners, the property owners, the developers decide how much parking to build, and they know, like they're in the point is that they're in the best position to know how much parking they actually need, when their peak times are, peak usage. And so I would say yes, but we leave those decisions with the folks on the ground who really understand what their seasonal demands are, what their weekly, daily demands are.
All right, we'll go to a question from online. Do your studies include semi-automated stackers since their costs have drastically been reduced around above grade garages?
Oh, I would say this fixer company, they have a lot of different aspects. No, we did not include semi-automatic, but I mean, this sounds expensive, right? Anytime you have a parking structure, the price per spot is really expensive. But I can't speak to that specifically. It's a very interesting question.
Yeah, we'll go to another question from online. Example, the president of a neighborhood association of single family homes complains that some new apartment complex nearby didn't build enough parking and thus people park on the neighborhood's narrow streets. How would you respond to this?
I mean, essentially this happened in Portland, right? We had a lot of new buildings that didn't build any parking and the area got denser, more people moved into a neighborhood, and then there's more parking on the streets. I would say the best way to deal with this, right? We really need people to have faith that the city can manage the on-street parking, right? Because this complaint is not that like people aren't parking in the parking lots, it's that too many people are parking on the street. And the only people who can manage street parking is the city, right? Who owns that right of way. So in a most like proactive situation, someone in the development services could see, hey, there's a big new building coming. We expect 300 more residents to move into this neighborhood, and maybe let's like start kicking off some conversations about making an on-street parking permit program so that when residents move in, right, you kind of need, if you're moving in anywhere, and if you have a car, you kind of need a plan for where you're going to store it. I have a car, I live in a building without any parking. And before I moved in, I kind of evaluated like, what are the options around me, right? There's 2 off-street parking lots that are private that I could pay monthly $80 a month to park in. And I have not done that because on-street parking is free. The parking is completely unmanaged where I live. There's no meters, there's no permits. I would love to buy a permit if the city offered one. But realistically, I just park on the street and I move my car certain regular amount to avoid getting a ticket. But if that was not the situation, if I knew I wasn't going to be able to park on the street for a long time because permits were sold out or the price was expensive, then I would think about those off-street parking lots. So I think, you know, incoming residents have a lot more choice in figuring out what works for them in a new housing situation than existing residents. So there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of design permit systems to kind of privilege the existing residents who are like experiencing this big change, maybe that's happening in their neighborhood. We get into like a lot of issues of fairness when we're trying to manage this. It's a limited resource, right? The curbside space. We get into these fights every time someone wants to replace on-street parking with a bike lane, right? Or businesses are making those little plazas and taking out parking, right? It's a really valuable space and the city should manage it like it's a valuable space. So those are some options. But I would encourage people to think about it in a way that you would about like, is having a dishwasher important to you in your next apartment? Is having a walk-in closet? Parking is a amenity in housing. It's not the most important amenity, and the amount of importance varies from person to person. So it's really good and important that people can have the choice to figure out what situation is going to work for them.
Yeah, and I have an example from Anchorage as well. I'd mentioned this restaurant, the Rustic Goat. And there was it was very popular when it opened. The parking lot could not accommodate all the people who drove there. Anchorage is a driving city. We have people who bike and take the bus, but it's a very small percentage of the population. So a lot of people were parking on the street to go to the Rustic Goat. And the neighbors were not happy about that. So what happened was they built extra surface parking across the street, and that was it. But the question then is, do we apply the standards that we apply to the Rustic Goat to every business across the city, to all housing developments, to all businesses? Because, you know, just across town, we talked to a dentist who had 50 parking spots for his practice when he only ever uses like half of them and the others sit vacant. And the city was actually telling him he needed to build more parking. So he's being penalized. You know, he wanted to build a new business next door. He wanted to build a dental lab. He wanted to build like a sort of side hustle with ATVs he wanted to sell. Anyway, he was like, you know, being crippled by these parking requirements. And we talked to a few other business owners in town as well, who represent a pretty small slice of folks who want to do more with their land, but can't. And should they all be penalized because this one restaurant over in West Anchorage didn't have enough parking? I mean,
yeah. Also, like they figured out their own solution, right? They had a site-specific problem and they solved it, right?
Yeah.
By adding this extra parking because they realized the building was underparked and it was, I don't know, I guess a headache. I went there, it was tasty.
So the argument is not, let's get rid of parking, let's like, you know, take it away. It's let's allow each site to right-size parking to fit their needs. But parking is not going away, and it shouldn't, nor should it.
Thank you. So our next question is from in the room.
Yeah, I was just curious how, like with the parking mandate repeals, how it impacts accessibility and like folks with disability who might be relying on parking spaces. I just was curious what the impacts were.
Yeah. So for ADA parking requirements now, you can't require a place to have parking that doesn't already, but they do require a certain percentage of those spaces to be allocated to be accessible. So something interesting that Anchorage just did in their reform is they increase those ratios so that when parking is built, there'll be more accessible parking spaces than there were before. But we get into this, especially with disability access, right? Some people have conflicting access needs, right? So while one person might be really, really reliant on getting around in a car, for other people with disabilities that don't drive in a car, maybe that can't drive and they're getting around in other modes, the presence of more cars is actually dangerous. So it's a really sensitive balance here of trying to accommodate as many people's needs as possible. So, and cities also always have the option of designating on-street parking spaces to be handicap accessible. Yeah, this is a conversation that's coming up around this that we hear lots about, right? How do we ensure that there's still accessible parking spaces and that if there's no parking or not as much parking as before?
So we're going to try and fit 2 more questions in, both from online. So let's see if we can fit them in the next 5 minutes or so. So one is related to Oregon's approach to removing parking only along transit routes. Doesn't this create a situation where a transit agency route planner is now empowered to change where minimums apply based on where they choose to place their routes? If transit routes change, are the minimums supposed to come back?
Yes, this is a big negative of this type of reform, right? Why do we get rid of parking requirements near transit? It's because it's most politically viable. It's not because parking requirements make more sense in other places. They don't make sense. They're not worth defending anywhere in the city, in my opinion. But yes, that kind of change about like, what if the routes change or what if there's a reroute? It really puts property owners into like a bit of a weird position where right, their zoning changed based on this like service, right, which can kind of go through periods of more investment and disinvestment over the years. So I agree, this is not a great solution, and I really hope that we kind of altogether politically move away from this type of solution and just to go to something that's a little more permanent and wide scale. We have heard from some Oregon cities that they're going with like that first option because they don't want to be dependent on transit service, right? It's going to be too confusing in the future if something changes. And to keep up with that, and it's just simpler to get rid of them altogether.
Just real fast, I'm seeing Q&A questions in the chat here, and I know we're not going to be able to get to all of them. Is there a way you can send us those questions and we can address them offline?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So with the couple minutes we have left, maybe we can try and squeeze a short answer in for the individual from Boston. So they've been working on parking reform, and in many instances are eliminating parking minimums, and in some cases ever putting in parking maximums. What they're running into is developers saying they cannot get financing without a certain parking ratio, especially for residential and labs use. Is there something other communities have run into, and is there any examples on how to overcome this particular objection?
Yeah, who I've heard the most talk about this is the mayor of Emeryville, California. They have some pretty strict parking maximums and have had this issue with financiers, right? So cities they're just like one backstop in how much parking you build, right? And all the financing and the banks and what's considered normal and like a risky investment, depending on the parking, right? That's kind of up to them. So every year there's like getting more case studies that banks can have and compare like pro formas for buildings that have less parking than they used to. So I think eventually like this dynamic will change, but it's a good like negotiating point with the city, and cities often can allow a variance to go over the parking maximum in that type of a situation, but it's a good opportunity for that dialogue. And I know in Emeryville, they come up this with sure, you can go over the parking maximum, but we're going to ask you to do this other thing since you're inviting a lot more cars into this development than we really want you to. And that's kind of how they have used this in that kind of way. But parking maximums usually aren't that much in play because they're set really high, more high than people really want to build. So if they're coming up, it means your maximum is at a good level.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you all for attending today's Friday Transportation Seminar, which also happens to be the last in the fall 2022 series. For those of you attending online, after this seminar ends, you'll have the opportunity to complete a brief survey about today's event. It only takes a couple of minutes, and we would really appreciate your feedback. Again, any questions unanswered will be sent to the presenters, and they'll have the opportunity to respond. Catie, Jeannette, thank you again so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful weekend and have a wonderful holiday season.
Thank you.
Thank you.